Good afternoon. My name is Maria Perrotta Berlin, and on behalf of SCEEUS, the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics, I'm very pleased to welcome you all, you who are here and all of you who are joining us online to this seminar. We are here to discuss a strategy to help Ukraine win the war, together with some guests of honor. And I'm really deeply honored and humbled to share the stage with our guests today. Let me quickly introduce them to you. So with the exception of Torbjörn Becker, who is the director of SCEEUS, and of late a tireless champion of support to Ukraine in Sweden, as well as in several international fora. All of them come more or less directly from Kyiv. Tymofiy Mylovanov and Nataliia Shapoval represent KSE, the Kyiv School of Economics. Tymofiy is the president of the school, as well as former Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Agriculture of Ukraine. And Nataliia is the vice president for policy research and head of KSE Institute. Formally, they're academics. However, we can well say that since the start of the war, their everyday life is not really looking like the normal day-to-day of academics, even as involved in policy as they were already before. Now they, together with the KSE team, have really stepped up and to support their government and their country in so many more ways. It is really such a source of inspiration and awe to listen to them talk about all the things they do, which we will do in a few short minutes. And also here with us today is Andreas Umland, who is an analyst at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, and was also for a long time based in Kyiv. So we can say that Andreas represents the links that already are strong, and we hope to build even stronger between Sweden and Ukraine within academia, which is our territory, but also beyond that. So I think it's appropriate perhaps to start by asking first our external guests to tell us something about what is life looking like in Kyiv right now, and what's your work looking like right now. Perhaps we can ask Nataliia to start.
Good evening, everyone. Yeah, so we just came from Kyiv, and yeah, I'm a bit nervous. At KSE, basically from the second day of the war, we started, figuring out how we can help out. And Tymofiy Mylovanov, who is our president, will tell more about the overall picture. But I will start from how we started working with the government, with the policy questions that we could identify. Exactly the second day of war, Tymofiy wrote to some of our policymakers asking, so what we can do. And with that point of time, we started working basically on sanctions, proposing what we can do on this economic front, but also on evaluation of the damages to Russian economy. So in this last more than half a year, we've been focusing on that. And hopefully, yeah, these strategies will succeed. So getting to this question discussion today, is even before this had been that Ukraine economy gonna fall economy again before this, even like 2 months ago or something, the estimates would be like something between 10% to lose the GDP. Organizations like IMF, World Bank, they would be saying something like percent. So I don't believe in these estimates of 5% or something, but that's another discussion. The big point is that Ukrainian economy is falling much faster. And then with these air strikes on the energy infrastructure, is gonna be falling even more, because before we came, we would have on average 4 hours of electricity during the day time, and like the rest of time we wouldn't have electricity. So we can all of us can work something that is not just laptop or phone where you just can do your work as analysts. It's even more damaging. So it means that for the next year and already now it's critical to come up with solutions that would help Ukrainian economy to sustain at better pace than it had been this year. So we cannot allow that Ukrainian economy loses half of GDP and hope that it can sustain as it was even this year. And for Russian economy, the same, our sanctions and strategy should be such that it is more effective. Now it's like 8 months of the war. All there had been like 8 packages of EU to sanction dual-use goods, and now we observe Iron drones hitting Ukraine. So that's it says that our work wasn't effective enough. So with these estimates, it means that first, Ukrainian economy should be mobilizing for the military effort more effectively than before. Secondly, it means that Ukraine should get more sustainable financial support from the partners. And it means, according to estimates, before we knew how much energy infrastructure is destroyed, we were estimating that it would require like $50 billion for the next year to Ukrainian economy to sustain, which would cover the budget deficit of approximately $38 billion, and the rest, like rapid recovery and all kind of changes during the year that could come because of the macro shocks and because of the changes in the exchange rate, for example. But now these figures are likely to be even slightly more for next year. And this money are so it's pretty clear how it's composed. Basically, right now, Ukrainian budget is twice as higher than it had been before the war. It means that we have one budget to finance our, as always, healthcare, teachers, etc. But on top of that, we have another budget of approximately the same size to finance salaries to the military and all kind of military expenditures. And this is how these numbers are being calculated for next year. Then on the sanctions front, again, we had this discussion with Torbjörn just a few minutes ago about what else should be done. And unfortunately, a lot of trade is not yet sanctioned. If we look at EU, for example, 60%, if we take into account oil, would be under sanctions to import from Russia, but other 40% would not be under sanctions. And in some cases, there would be some serious reason for that. In other cases, there wouldn't be serious reason for that. And it means that trade should be more under sanctions, but also we are calling for, and we are also part of the Yermak McFall International Working Group of Sanctions, and Tymofiy and Torbjörn and myself. This is a group established by the president of Ukraine and 100 academics around that and former diplomats. So one of the things that we suggested, along with trade sanctions, are kinds of state sponsor of terrorism sanctions, where including Russia into blacklist of FAT, so that more massively transactions with Russia are under very high scrutiny. So, and before we go, I would like to highlight some other things that we all can be doing, not waiting for, big IMF or government guys to support Ukrainian effort, is what KSE Charitable Foundation is doing. Before the war, for example, they were collecting scholarship for students, but now they collect, pretty small, I would say, contributions to repair bomb shelters for school. So it's like $10,000 and the whole village can go to school, which I think is amazing. And I guess for the next year, we all can do much more of things of that kind. Thank you.
Thank you, Nataliia. Perhaps Timofey can follow up on this. If Ukraine is going to own reconstruction. We cannot let the economy collapse now. So what are the needs right now? How do you see them met? You want to?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for having me here. Okay, so the question is what should be done right now with Ukraine so it can, with the economy of Ukraine. The war economy is simple. You basically have to, you have your GDP, which is equal consumption plus investment plus government expenditure. You don't have any investment. So investment is zero. Then private consumption goes down because the preferences change. I don't go to a spa service anymore. I'm happy to have heating in my house. Industries like tourism collapse, and we can go industry by industry, right? And at the same time, government expenditure goes up because you have three areas. One is military. Second one is critical infrastructure, energy. I don't take having light here for given. I don't take it. It's not for granted anymore. And water in toilets, excuse me for making it vivid, that's not given. And if it's not given, you have all kinds of hygiene issues. So it's very quickly go back to kind of medievalish feel, that a little bit more, several more hours without water or light, electricity, and the society can collapse. You start thinking about, whether we should change, transfer our university into a shelter where we're buying sleeping bags, we're buying, mats where we can, stockpiling on water. Thinking about putting water towers like they are in the US everywhere. Now I understand why you want a water tower. It looked ridiculous to me every time I visit New York and I look at this tower, water tanks. Now I don't think they're ridiculous anymore. So you have to support that. And then the third one, you have to support people. Basically social expenditure. It's a very simple economy, very resilient in that sense, because whatever business is operating. There are these guys who are repairing electricity, power grid under shelling. And, we daily read how much, imagine now you're an engineer, you're sitting you're just an engineer or a, dispatch or someone who is like, just a guard sitting in a power plant. That's a dangerous job, right? Because a missile can land there. So people go and do their jobs daily. Paramedics, they come to treat wounded, and then new missiles come for the second wave of missile comes. So all these jobs now, kind of in the US, when I was a grad student, I remember my classmate, Emily Blanchard, who is now working in DC as an economist for the government. We were discussing why paramedics and firemen in the US are held by the society in such a high respect. We were kind of arrogant young kids who were looking down on other professions. I understand now why those professions in Ukraine are gonna be heroes for decades to come. So how do you maintain the economy during the wartime? You provide scarce resources. Scarce resources are dollars or euros for us, not hryvnias. We can print hryvnias, but hryvnias doesn't buy ammunition. We're just having this discussion on highway, on the subway, right? That about sexism in military and kind of West-plaining sexism. When our military female officers come up to a CNN or BBC and they're being asked, how is it to be a woman in military? And they say, we need more bullets and ammunition. And I say, yeah, we understand that, but how is it to be a woman? And they're like, but we need guns. And that's the kind of, that's how it feels. You ask us questions, how is it to maintain economy? And I'm like, we need guns, guys. We need guns. because we're out of munition. You know, it's a serious war. 7% of our buildings, residential buildings, have been destroyed or damaged. 7%. And it's only a part of a country has been under war, 20 to 30%. That means there everything is destroyed. So just imagine every 10th building, like every 10th building is destroyed. We have a program. We don't talk about losses, but we have a program of MBA program for veterans after 2014, 2016. And in that program, we had 150 to 120 graduates. 2/3 of them got mobilized, volunteered after the war started. 10 of them have been killed in action. It's like 7% of our alumni body in a program, in an MBA program. That takes toll on everyone. So, you know, it's simple. We need weapons. It's not a theoretical exercise anymore. You know, could we have a diplomatic solution, you know, or could we have avoided the war? It would have been great to live in a different world. But today, civilians and military essentially are dying daily. And every hour of this discussion about export controls and technology and something and how to coordinate between Switzerland and Germany on some critical input in a howitzer, that means lives of Ukrainians and including my friends. It comes home very quickly. So I have two sisters, and my big sister husband is from Donetsk. In 2014, he fought. He's Russian speaking. He's from Donetsk, and he fought against separatists. And on the first days of the war, you know, he's decommissioned because he has concussions, multiple. You know, he's like in 60s really. So he calls up his friends and he goes and they take a tank, which is used in the military academy downtown Kyiv. They fix up that tank and they just roll it out of the academy to defend a corner. We now run a foundation, KSE Foundation, which used to be before the war, as Nataliia said, Foundation for Education. But we have been recently, reached out to by people from the academy saying that all the weapons that we had, all the howitzers, all the mortars, all the tanks from military academies are in the front lines. We have nothing left. So they're asking us to buy mortars that new cadets can train. So what does the economy need during the war? It needs weapons to stop the war as soon as possible. Okay, so that's the first, I think we have to instill the sense of urgency. Now, there is a question, can we have peace, a ceasefire at least? The problem with that is, it's a very appealing notion that somehow we can wake up in the world pre-February 24. We won't. The world has changed. Maybe not everyone has realized that, but your government is increasing the defense budget times, I think. I don't know specific numbers, but across Europe, we're talking about billions, tens of billions, and hundreds of billions of dollars. I see recruitment campaigns in your subway. It wasn't there when the last time I visited. It's everywhere, military, you know. It's the same in other countries. This machine started moving on both sides. And to just pretend it's not moving is a self-denial. The question is, what can we do? Can democracies have a proper, effective answer to guarantee security in Europe at least? And I don't think there is an answer. So I think the security frameworks have failed. So the United Nations, NATO have been built up or created to prevent exactly this kind of thing from happening. And Russia has hacked it because it moved from, they have been built for a discrete warfare, invasion, Article 5. 0-1. What Russia has done, it has learned to do it in a continuous, way, one step at a time, gradual escalation. They actually bombed Georgian cities. I didn't know it. I didn't know, so I'm guilty of being ignorant. In 2008, Russia used missiles to bomb civilians in Georgia. They're not doing anything new, just the scale is different. Have they committed war crimes before? Yeah, absolutely. Chechnya. 2 wars in Chechnya. Horrible things, right? So there's nothing new in the playbook. It's just the scale. And so when we say about ceasefire or solution or peace or something, are we talking about sustainable peace or we're talking about stopping the current dynamics? We can stop, but it's temporary. It's like alcoholism. Someone is sick. Russia is sick. We can try to stop it, don't drink tonight, don't be violent tonight, but that doesn't solve the problem of tomorrow. The moment I'm going to look away, the pattern will repeat. So the question is how you treat it. How do you stop the disease? And I don't think there is an answer. So we are fortunate to have great leadership right now, historic leadership in Ukraine. It's for the first time in 200 or 300 years, we have government which is with the people, pro-Ukrainian government. Because in all previous wars and conflicts, our government was either colonial or was corrupt, and it was immediately kind of cutting deals and selling out Ukrainian sovereignty. So that's why this time for us it's different. But everything Russians do is reminiscent of what they've done to us in the previous century. What Stalin has done to us, what Lenin has done to us. I remember my teachers of math in 80s, when I was in finishing school, they were telling me stories how they were afraid between classes to step out to a cafe because they could have been stopped on the streets in 80s by KGB guys during the Soviet Union time and just simply interrogated why they're not at work during the. That was the society. That was considered to be normal. I moved to study to the US because I didn't want to live in that society. And when I came back in 2014, that was a different society in Ukraine. It's a democratic, it's a teenage democracy with all its problems. Like, you all have, what teenage problems could be. We have them and more, but it's a democracy. And now these guys are crushing the democracy. But I think, they've been doing, if you look at this, they've done Chechnya, they've done Moldova, they've done Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Belarus. That's a pattern, and they would not have been able to attack Ukraine the way they do it had they not taken Crimea, right? And had they not suppressed Belarus, and had they not got Kazakhstan on their side because of energy supplies. So it's not, Ukraine is not, we're all looking at Ukraine as a Ukraine. It's not a Ukraine. They've been doing it in a very systemic, in a very pragmatic and strategic way, ensuring that they can put pressure on us from the north, ensuring that they can put pressure on us from the south, not just from the east, and even from Moldova, from the west, stretching us thin, and then making sure that Kazakhstan cannot provide alternative supplies of gas to alleviate the energy crisis. So I think it's important to help economy of Ukraine during the war, because if Ukraine collapses, it's just gonna be time until the next episode, and we just can only guess whether it's gonna be Moldova, Baltics, Georgia, something in stance, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, any of this, they will keep collecting land. Their objective function is not welfare. Their objective function is territory. Not even their own humans, not their own. They put people in tanks so they know they will die. They send them and we shoot them using your weapons, and laws. They die there. They know it and they put more kids into the tanks, in old tanks, in older tanks, and they send them to die. So it's something which is very difficult for us to understand. It's like it's difficult for us to understand the mind of an alcoholic or a drug addict. And it's very difficult, it seems rational to reason. Why don't you stop? Why? It's win-win for everyone that you stop. But they don't, right? So I think we have this problem. It's this more serious problem than we tend to think of this as an isolation. It was Belarus, it was Georgia, it was Ukraine. It's not. It's a bigger problem. They're connected, these dots. So that's one thing. Therefore, it is important to support Ukraine because, frankly and very pragmatically, the world is lucky that somehow Ukraine has decided to fight. Okay, because otherwise it would have been on the border with Poland, some pro-Russian regime or something like that. And who knows what would be next, So it just, and it's extremely efficient for you to stop Russia using Ukraine. Because the amount of funds you're going to invest in energy and in weapons and in defense and this, diverted from education, science, social support is just, it's peanuts, this 50 billions of dollars that, Ukraine needs. So that's on the macro level. On the micro level, I think the challenges are critical infrastructure. Everything is related with critical infrastructure as the challenge, weapons and that. But, basically, you know that we have run out of stingers, right? You don't, right? The world has run out of stingers already. Air defense are thin because they are thin, not because someone is unwilling to give them. And you see what Russia is doing, they're targeting the entire area. So if we're going to be thinking about protecting Baltics or Poland, we're not ready. We're not ready. It's our hope that no one will attack. It's just our hope. It's our belief. There's no technology. There's no capacity at this point to protect. Plus caliber missiles, Kinjal and others, there's no technology to, they're supersonic, hypersonic. It's difficult to intercept them. So the situation is difficult. It's serious. And I think Ukrainian economy, basically during the war, is very simple. You just need to support military people and maintain human capital inside country so that there's something to rebuild afterwards. It's like a plant roots. You have to keep the roots there so that it can grow back, right? In every industry, you don't want any industry to be fully destroyed, so you need to maintain the industries. The companies which survive there and they are thriving. Many, like Kyiv School of Economics, we have more students than the last year. We have more fundraising. We have these activities. We're scaling up maybe 10 times than relative to what the previous year was, because there is a cause and we meet that cause. So people are coming to support. So a lot of, it was bizarre on the first day of the war. We were traveling together, jets are flying, and is it our jets, not our jets? We need to pick up water because it seems to be a natural thing to pick up water. So we go to the supermarket, and there are these people at supermarket who are taking your carts, and selling food and bringing water, and jets are flying over. They are not packing, they're not going home, They're getting you waters that you can evacuate. So some retail networks that too are like that. They stayed and they continued to operate. Post office, it's another amazing story. That guy I told my sister, my big sister husband, he gets on this tank and he doesn't have any warm clothes, and it's winter, it's February. So we delivered, we bought online warm clothes and we delivered to Kyiv by Ukrainian FedEx, Nova Poshta. And then one of our analysts just picked up and drove in the middle of this with a car from a post office to the tank to bring him, warm clothing and food. It's very difficult to you get used to it. I told this story early, and I'll wrap up. I'll tell this story early in the meeting that when the first missiles landed in Kyiv, I was completely shocked and overwhelmed. Last week, remember, I was like, there were missiles, and I was going to a shower. I'm like, explosion, another explosion. I'm like looking in the window, like I'm gonna go in the shower before the water is off. So you basically get used to it. All right, so Ukraine needs support. This is not something we want other countries. No one, you don't want anyone else to experience that. We're all traumatized, we're all PTSD, even if we don't admit it, we might be in denial about this. But I think Europe is in denial about how big of a problem we're facing now. It's a coordinated, comprehensive set of activities by a dictatorship or authoritarian regime with an extremely aggressive military power, which uses military power to its foreign policy aims. And that's the previous century. It's 100 years ago. It's not the 21st century. So that's a problem. That's a real problem. And it's in your backyard, or, it's your neighbor. Unfortunately, it's our neighbor. There's a joke from 2014 that Russia demands, when they ask what are the demands of Russia? Russia demands that Ukraine moves its borders away from Russia. That's the demand. Because whenever we have borders with them, they feel threatened, therefore they invade. They keep invading until we disappear. All right, so I think the answer is simple: give funds, give weapons, and start thinking about serious framework that can ensure security after this. Because there's no answer right now. Democracies can't produce a proper answer, and the NATO and the United Nations are not capable of addressing this threat. In the future, once it's over, I believe Putin has to go, because it will give an opportunity to. So basically, the strategy should be put as much pressure as possible on Russia, so that there is internal fighting at the top level, and so this power, and either Putin makes them guilty, or he himself has to go. And that would give an opportunity to renegotiate the regime, moving forward. But once that moment appears, it is important that people don't get complacent and don't forget that the problem is not individuals, but the fact that Russia has aggressive military regime. So if anyone has to be demilitarized, it's Russia. They can be an authoritarian regime. That's to them. I don't think it's our job to figure out for Russians how to run their country, but it's our job to make sure that they don't use their military to invade countries around them. And I think once that opportunity will be there, and it will be there, it's like dark, but it's gonna get, at some point, there will be a sunrise. And then there will be this opportunity to negotiate with Russia and put some conditions. And that's the time not to put in conditions on them that you have to be a democracy. That's up to them to figure out. We should not be babysitting other people. That's their job. Otherwise, they will not learn. That's up to them. If they want to be a dictatorship, that's their job. But we need to make sure that they cannot invade other countries. So those should be the conditions. And I'm worried that the world will get the priorities wrong. That the world will go all into this. Or let's make democratic elections in Russia, this and that, but let them keep their military at the level they have. And that will be a huge mistake. That's what happened 30 years ago. We tried to build democracy there and forgot to take the nukes away. And we failed in both. So, that's the strategy, I guess, after the war. And right now, put as much pressure on Russia as possible and give as much support to Ukraine as possible, economically and militarily, so that Russia regime collapses as soon as possible. And I can talk substance why other solutions, in my view, are not possible, such as negotiations, but because there's no mechanism to enforce any deal with Russia. And furthermore, February 24 has destroyed that little trust that has been left in relationships with Russia. And so to build back that trust will take something extraordinary. And the perception of current regime of people in power who have betrayed previous deals and promises will always stand in the way of building that trust. So in that sense, some change is needed there for the trust to be built eventually. And it probably will take decades, not years. Thank you.
Yeah, a very fair point. Thank you, Timofey. And a very clear message of urgency. We need more weapons, we need to support the economy, but first the war must end and we must stop Russia. So I think Andreas wanted to come in on the same point.
Yes, I was actually making signals to Maria to put me right after Timofey, because I wanted actually to continue on that, what Timofey said, and elaborate a little bit on why the West should support Ukraine and sanction Russia, because I don't know how it's here in Sweden. I'm German, and I know the German discussion better. What I often observe is this juxtaposition of, on the one side, yes, our empathy for Ukraine is high. Yes, our solidarity for Ukraine is high. Here we have empathy and solidarity, but then we have also concerns about our own prosperity and our own security. Yeah, so, and usually this is then, you have these sort of emotional, idealist people who want, support Ukraine, who want to justice and so on. And then you have the realists, yeah, who say, yeah, but we have our own interests, national interests, our own prosperity, our own security. And I think that's often the wrong way to go, at least as I see it now. I think there's now also the solidarity is going down, because I would say, I mean, there are all these humanitarian issues, but I think the biggest scandal of this entire war is that not only that it is determined by the fact that Russia has nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction, and Ukraine doesn't. And the scandal about this, and everybody would, all sides would, of course, behave differently if one of these things or both of these things would be different. Yeah. So if you imagine that Ukraine had nuclear weapons, or if you would imagine that Russia would not have nuclear weapons, or that then everybody Russia would behave differently, Ukraine would behave differently, the West, the other countries would behave differently. So that is basically determining the entire situation. And the scandal about that is that Russia is permitted explicitly in perhaps the most important international treaty that exists, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to have nuclear weapons. It's explicitly permitted to have these nuclear weapons. And Ukraine is explicitly forbidden to have these nuclear weapons. And most of you will know that the even more odd thing here is that Ukraine once had nuclear weapons. In fact, Ukraine had once more nuclear warheads than England, Great Britain, France, and China taken together after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And it gave up these nuclear weapons, became a so-called non-nuclear weapons state, among others because of the Chernobyl experience, but also on pressure not only from Russia, but also from the West, especially from the United States, that was putting, read, for instance, the book by Stephen Pfeiffer, who was involved in these, American diplomat who was involved in these negotiations, the Trident and the Eagle, where he describes how this that was achieved. And I think what we have to, and so Russia is violating here this non-proliferation regime. It's putting it on its head, and it's making suggestions with every new day of this war to countries and politicians and experts and diplomats outside Eastern Europe, outside Europe, all over the world, namely saying that, at the end of the day, might is right. You cannot rely on international organizations. You cannot rely on international law. You cannot rely on security assurances, on all sorts of sweet talk from Washington or Brussels or Berlin and so on. You have to rely on yourself, and you need the bomb if you want to be secure. And especially if you may have also interests in territories of neighboring countries, you may also want to have the bomb, because Russia is now demonstrating that if you have the bomb, you can then actually use conventional forces to do whatever you want, and the country that you attack will not get a no-fly zone from NATO or from somebody, because everybody will be afraid of your bomb. Yeah, so that is the thing. the same goes for the UN, for the United Nations, and especially for the UN Security Council. So Ukraine has been a founding member of the United Nations. The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was in 1945 one of the founding members of the United Nations. The Russian Federation was not a founding member of the United Nations. On 9th of December 1991, in a treaty, the so-called Belovesh Treaty, the Soviet Union was officially dissolved. This is a ratified, officially registered treaty, ratified by Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, officially registered with the United Nations, which dissolved the Soviet Union. The Russian Federation is now a member of the United Nations and a member of the UN Security Council, although it has never applied to actually become a member of the United Nations and of the Security Council. So this whole war is putting the entire international system on its head. And we should communicate this to our publics, that this is not only about Ukrainian children, this is about our children. And we should communicate to Russia that this is about our national interests, about our future, not the Ukrainian future. This is another country, which is in a sad situation, which we have feelings for, but our heads are about our children, our grandchildren. And we should also tell the Asian countries, the Latin American countries, the countries that are still trading with Russia, that this is a fundamental problem. And if we're going to introduce finally at some point, I think we may have to come the secondary sanctions, we have to explain that this is not out of solidarity and empathy for Ukraine. This is because of our own national interests. So that is, I think, that is the click that is still missing in the Western discourse. There's, we need to, in a way, forget about Ukraine. We need to think about our own interests in this whole war, and then we may get to a different stage, both in the help for Ukraine and in the sanctioning of Russia. That was going to have another round on recovery. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Andreas. You're going to get the word back. I want to bring up the issue of sanctions, because sanctions can be also another way to stop Russia, or can they? Are sanctions effective? Maybe Torbjörn wants to come in the discussion on that. Seeing an effect of sanction is important also for the realists in the Western world, as Andreas was mentioning.
I'm now going to run the risk of both mansplaining Nataliia and westplaining Tymofiy. This is a little bit of an internal joke, because we had this discussion yesterday, and standing here, being who I am in Sweden, I obviously take a little bit of a different perspective, and Nataliia and Tymofiy is living this daily. So you have to excuse me if I'm saying things that would have been said better by Nataliia or Tymofiy. But yes, again, I think this idea that sanctions are not working, let's just start with that as the basis for this discussion. And this is also actually something that Maria has been writing about herself. The first thing we have to remember is that sanctions are evaluated often by looking at the countries that are subject to sanctions today. And this is an important point Maria is making in a policy brief, that we're not including in a lot of these studies all of the countries that did not take certain actions because they were afraid of the sanctions that would follow. So, we should actually remember that what we're doing to Russia today is also sending a very clear signal to China, for example, with respect to Taiwan, or to Iran, or to other countries like that. So we're not actually, again, only thinking about Ukraine and Russia. It's what we focus on here today, but the whole sanctions discussion needs to be put in a much wider framework, basically. So I think that's the first thing. The other thing is that, as Nataliia was hinting, we get all of these official numbers now on how much is the Russian economy suffering because of sanctions. The latest IMF forecast that came out in October has a forecast of Russia declining maybe 4% this year. The Russian central bank governor, Putin in Valdai, they're all sitting there saying, oh, sanctions don't matter. Look how strong we are. We are so flexible. We have invented new ways of doing things. I'm sorry, but it's all bullshit. It really doesn't work that way. Russia has been discussing ways of getting off energy dependency since 1991, when we discussed market, how should Russia develop. Medvedev, when he became a president, the first thing he was discussing was basically modernization and diversification and all of these things. It still hasn't happened. The Russia GDP number, you can explain growth in Russia to maybe 75, 80% by just what's happening to international oil prices. One exogenous variable explains maybe 75% of Russia's growth. This is why sanctioning energy, trading with Russian energy is so important today. If we take this seriously, and also this discussion about putting a price cap on Russian oil is very central. This is the fundamental driving force of the Russian economy. It provides, on average, maybe half of the revenues to the Russian budget, oil and gas, different taxes, etc. So, of course, it's important to maintain sanctions and strengthen sanctions, and in particular to focus on not buying Russian energy at world market prices. It could actually be clever to let them sell, but at a much lower price. That can alleviate some problems in poorer countries to avoid sort of people in Africa or Asia becoming even poorer than they are today. So again, I think sanctions are still extremely important. And as Nataliia also hinted at, I think we can do much more in terms of restricting what we're actually trading with Russia. I mean, now we have the principle, everyone have heard this idea of dual use technologies, basically a microchip that can either go into a computer or into a rocket, dual use. But to be honest, a lot of the stuff that we're sending across borders could be dual use. The military forces would need food or clothes or regular, some car parts even, all of these things. So the list becomes very long when you think about what is needed to actually be involved in the war. So there are a lot of extra things we can do, but most importantly, we have to not sort of buy into the stupid narrative of saying that these sanctions are not hurting the Russian economy. It's clear, if you're an economist, if you know what's going on in Russia, of course, they have learned how to deal with macroeconomic challenges because of all the crises they have handled over the last 20 years. But they are definitely on a very steep outward trajectory in terms of economic development. And of course, you're not maybe fighting a war with your dollars or euros, but these are the things that determine how many tanks you can buy, how many rockets you can buy, how many soldiers you can pay to come from different countries to fight in Ukraine. So the short answer is that we need to keep up the pressure on the Russian economy, on the Russian financial system, and trade with Russia to basically limit its prospects of being sort of successful in the Ukrainian war, because that's not something any of us here would like to see. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Then we can ask Nataliia perhaps to complete. You have done a lot of work on sanctions with the Yermak McFall expert group. And what do you see that is still lacking? How can we complete the sanctions that are in place? But also perhaps how can we broadcast more to our audiences that sanctions are working and the Russian economy is not doing so well after all?
Yes, so what Torbjörn said about energy, it's the elephant in the room, and the devil again also in detail, because and I think it's so on the one hand, there is already kind of embargo on Russian oil starting from December 5. and then it's going to be even deeper from January, and then this price cap, which is almost set. But I think it's not still done deal, because like several weeks ago, price cap was like $40-$55 leaked from the meetings. Now it's like more 60-65. So if we'll go to 80, you know. And I think this question of what's gonna be the price cap is very important. And if it's gonna be at the level of 50, 55, then Russia can lose half of its export revenues from energy next year. And it means that they're gonna be at kind of level of crisis that they faced in the previous years, in 2008, for example, or during COVID. But if it's something closer to 65, 70, then for Russia, it will be like much smaller decrease. And this kind of, I don't know, like why it happens like that to the full, but when they have 150 billion revenues or less from export of energy, they get into what is called crisis for them. And when they are not below this or at this point, they can handle. So I think this level of price cap gonna be a big difference. But otherwise, I agree that Russia should be isolated more fully. And my dream case scenario is that it should be like with Iran, or their friends right now. When at the worst times for Iran, where it was only one bank who was, and it wasn't even on the territory of Iran, who was allowed to make transactions with them. I think it's something towards what kind of we should be moving with Russia, because unfortunately, many ways to find more control of the transactions. I think there will be more and more stories like we have with Iran right now, and with their drones coming up more.
Thank you, Nataliia. So when this fine day comes and we can drink champagne and the war is over, Russia is defeated, then can we think a little bit about reconstruction? How do we best organize it? I think I would like to ask both Andreas and Torbjörn, that have thought about this a lot and talked to people, to describe how do you see this described in the West? How do people in the West think about this? And then maybe we can ask the Ukrainian perspective of this as well, on this as well. Who wants to start?
Well, in a way, I'm the least qualified because I'm a political scientist and not economist. But maybe I'll say some things from the political science sort of perspective. I think that has been already now in the air. I don't know what the Ukrainian colleagues think about it, that to a certain degree, the reconstruction and the flow of money will be not determined by Ukraine, but by the donors. And it will not be something similar to the Marshall Plan, but rather, which was where one country supported many countries, but here it will be many countries, hopefully supporting one country, and each of this country, each of the institutions may have its own ideas about how to channel the money, how to use the money, and it's going to be a difficult process to negotiate that. And I've been myself, and that's why maybe I'm a little bit qualified to comment on that, a part of a German developmental program in Ukraine, and they have their own traditions. You know, like CEDA has in Sweden, the USAID in the US, GIZ in Germany, and so on. There are certain lines, so to say, that have been established, and there may be not as much innovation sometimes as maybe necessary. So I think that may be one of the so far perhaps less discussed problems. And I think what is needed here, as far as I can see, to make clear from the Ukrainian side or also from pro-Ukrainian speakers, is that there also needs to be some contingency funding. There needs to be some basic funding for the state to develop, and it cannot be all left to the sort of old schemes of the sort of pre-war schemes of the developmental organizations that have their algorithms of doing that. But this is a post-war or war situation still that makes it special. The other thing that is, of course, here very special about Ukraine is the difficulties with private investment. And again, I'm not going to comment that here from the economic viewpoint, but rather the sort of political aspect of it, that this has been, in fact, an issue already discussed for a while. The insurance of foreign direct investment has been, to my knowledge, for the first time mentioned by George Soros in March 2014, not 2022, March 2014, in an article in The Guardian, where he already saw this as a key problem for Ukraine. How do you make sure that private investors will be coming to Ukraine in this during this conflict with Russia, and I guess that has to be taken care of. I think that's going to be maybe the most complicated, as far as I can see, issue in all of that. How to attract or make it possible for private investors to come, because I suppose, but again, the economists here will know better that it cannot be all done by public money. And from the sort of political point of view, what Ukraine here also needs is security, some sort of security, not only for the security of living, but also for providing securities, so to say, then to the economy. And there are three basic schemes here to do that, to provide security for the Ukrainian state, the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian economy, and perhaps also for foreign investors. That the first one and the easiest one and the most preferred one is an accession to NATO. That is the most sort of mostly discussed issue, also in Sweden nowadays. And my feeling is that we may be actually closer to a serious discussion of this issue that that some people think. So I've just been to a conference in Vilnius where people were remembering how the decision to include the Baltic countries in NATO, how short the time between this decision and the actual then accession of the Baltic countries was, and how suddenly this appeared, and that in the mid-1990s that was still something totally out of the discussion. And then in 2004, all three of them, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, became members. So I think that discussion needs to continue, and there may appear then at some point a window of opportunity. But until then, Ukraine needs some sort of security guarantees from countries that are ready to provide them. And then the question would be basically to every country that supports Ukraine, what kind of security guarantee it can provide, or which kind of collective security agreement it may be able to enter with Ukraine. For instance, we had the statement of 9 Central East European countries that supported Ukraine's application for NATO. That may be also then countries that may be able to provide security guarantees. That would be the intermarium concept, if you've ever heard of that. That's an old concept from the interwar period, when already the countries that came out of the different empires in Central Eastern Europe were thinking about their security and were thinking about creating an alliance of these new countries between Germany and the Soviet Union to make themselves more secure. Or the third concept that is now being discussed, and maybe that's the most realistic and most easy to implement, is what is called in Ukraine Big Israel, or what may be also called in political science armed neutrality, so that Ukraine would become militarily so strong that it can provide for its own security. And that's why also these weapons issue is not only important for the war, it's also important for the peace, because if you don't get this sort of basic sense of security in the country, that is also an enormous economic problem. And somehow it has to be provided either by NATO or by security guarantees from other countries or organizations, or by simply arming Ukraine to a sufficient degree that it can actually defend its territory, its cities, its factories.
Thank you, Andreas. Torbjörn.
Yes, I guess both Tymofiy and myself, we were involved in the CPR report discussing reconstruction of Ukraine. The work was led by Yuri Garnishenko, who is of course also a KSE alumni. But already then we were discussing that we may need to think about reconstruction in phases that starts already while war is going on in parts of Ukraine. We can't really wait to get some housing, critical infrastructure in place until Russia decides not to fire more missiles at Ukraine. So we need to think a little bit more forthcoming about what can we do today in different parts of Ukraine. And we cannot really sit on the fence and wait for this war to be over completely. The other thing is, of course, like Andreas was mentioning, there's going to be a lot of different countries who wants to contribute funds and skills, etc., in this process. So in the report we wrote with this team from CPR, we're arguing that we think, because also the second part of the title of today is become a successful member of the EU, which is sort of the longer term goal here, I think. We should think about an institution with very strong ties to the EU that coordinates the donor side. We should not have, Germans, Swedes, Americans, French, all of them running around in Kyiv asking for meetings with Tymofiy, Nataliia, the presidential administration. We need to get together in one room, all at the sort of once, sit down and make these plans together. That's going to be a critical part of also then tackling what a lot of people here are worried about, which is sort of corruption and misuse of funds. So we coordinate these things. We make a common plan that the Ukrainian government sort of tells us about, and then we can have a monitoring system together with the Ukrainian government and see that all of these things that we're discussing are actually implemented in the best possible way, because people in Ukraine are tired of corruption and taxpayers in the West complain about these things. So we're doing everyone a favor by just removing that possibility of misusing funds if we are ready to coordinate between the donors much more forcefully. All right, I'm going to stop here and let Nataliia and Tymofiy probably chip in.
So what recovery?
So some of the issues that are commonly mentioned and that Torbjörn also mentioned are the balancing coordination between different donors with a more pragmatic approach of letting everybody continue on their partnerships and whatever they can contribute with, balancing ownership in Ukraine with necessity of control and oversight, also the issues of corruption and so on. What is your view on this?
All right, so there are, I just can share my experiences. One is that everyone wants to be in control of recovery. It's just amazing, every agency out there, although the IMF are smart, they said no, not our mandate. But everyone else is kind of setting up a fund or setting up a platform, or people are trying to go to conferences and set up reputation for themselves that they can lead. Actually, there are a lot of people who want to be leaders of this fund or something. It's a typical career-driven politics and organizational politics. Organizations have their mandate and they want to get funding. There's a lot of funds potentially. This is counterproductive because it really creates this exacerbates to an extreme almost those inefficiencies which we see in international development aid when the mandates and territories are not clearly defined. And they are not clearly defined because none of the IFIs or institutions or domestic agencies or ministries or anyone is set up to be the platform, the ministry, or something for reconstruction. That's one thing. The second thing, I think, whatever the governance structure will be, the people who are running it on the international side have to be in Kyiv. You know, many of IFIs, the IMF is running the mission from Vienna. The World Bank doesn't have an office in Ukraine. They're writing assessment reports. They're, you know, suggesting how things, but they are not there actually. And you know, some things, I don't want to like be frivolous about this, but you know, you have to experience certain things in order to be able to assess them and estimate. And this is not a conceptual statement, it's a simple statement. On October 10th, when there were missile attacks on infrastructure, 2 hours after the missiles were in, the city was up and running. If you simply don't get this feel how people respond to it, and that's a valuable information, you know, how quickly infrastructure, you won't be able to get it in numbers when saying, oh, you know, 450,000 people were out of light and 2 hours after that they were, well, but the people offered, you know, like people were killed and half an hour after that coffee shops are working, you know. They put you know, they boarded up the windows and they opened for business. And you have to get this feel, you know, in order to be able, there's so much institutional detail, and by the time you get a report on this, that's going to be 2 weeks if you're lucky, or 2 months on average, you know, like how quickly October 10 shock to infrastructure was adjusted. And you have to make a lot of decisions between October 10 and those 2 months when you get a report about where to you know, allocate your resources. So you have to have leadership and expertise in Kyiv, whatever it will be, this reconstruction agency. I think that was also the case for the Marshall Plan, right? The decision making was in Germany. It was not run from other capitals. You know, it wasn't run from London or from Washington. It was run from the ground. You know, you go for coffee, you build relationships. It's much more complete information. So I think that's important. So one is to try to somehow overcome this career concerns where everyone wants to position, you know, like the World Bank is setting up their fund, the EBRD, the EU, like everyone is trying to, you know, be the leader and look good. That's going to get in the way. So coordination, there should be a platform. And so far, there hasn't been a platform. There's been Lugano meeting, has been Berlin meeting now. There's always this talk about corruption. It's an important talk, but that's not an excuse to do nothing in terms of coordination, okay? So if we talk about corruption and governance, then we have to make offers and propositions that, you know, okay, corruption is an issue. Yes, corruption is an issue, and especially in a wartime. We can look up the investigation reports on corruption in Iraq or Afghanistan. I'm not bringing back the history of Ukraine or anything like that prior to 2014. That's going to be an issue. But again, that's not an excuse to do nothing. You know, it's a reason to offer specific infrastructure, how to, you know, I would like to hear the words about audit and benchmarking and, you know, pilots and authorized developers, or, you know, some criteria based on, you know, procurement mechanisms, rather than talk about corruption. You know, corruption is specific. Is it done through procurement? Or is it done because benchmarking is wrong? No? Or is it done because you actually procure, but things don't get done and they are not audited and things have not been built? So, you know, what is that? Then, of course, Ukraine has to, you know, has to do several reforms, in my view. One is lobbying laws. You know, we have been fighting corruption in Ukraine, but we somehow feel that if we helicopter, it's arrogant. I think they believe that if we helicopter US, European, or Australian institutions to Ukraine, they will work. Using this analogy of teenagers democracy, it assumes away the dynamics. It says, oh, I know how an adult would behave, so I'm going to demand the same things from it. It's just the adult doesn't know. I have to put more pressure on teenager to behave as an adult. No, the teenager has to grow through this, right? It will take time. And often it is important that it is the teenager who grows, not that the parents are overly protective over him or her. It's a teenage democracy. It has to grow. It's a corruption and inefficiency. It's a political economy problem first, and then institutional problems second. Political economy means that if you do not have an answer to the question how political campaigns are financed, then you should not be surprised there will be corruption. Right? If you know it takes to get to an office $10 million if you're lucky, or maybe 100, with commercials and advertisement and people in the field and things like that. And of course, there's no way in Ukraine where you can demonstrate or trace $10 million, coming into someone's campaign because there's no law, it would be illegal and things like that. Then why are you surprised that there would be corrupt officials? We can impose more, this anti-corruption infrastructure and put more people in prison, but that doesn't change anything. You have to pay for a political commercial when you campaign, and someone is going to offer to pay for you. And if you are naive or not naive, if you're not naive, you're risking a prison later. If you're naive, you don't understand what's going on, but you will nonetheless get in office. And then they will present you with a bill. So you actually have to have a political campaign reform. You have to have a lobbying reform where lobbying is legalized, and not it's the old Soviet Union style legislation. It has to be legalized. And then you need to actually make sure that there is a further separation between the state and regulation and how people earn money. There are three ways. One is procurement. Procurement has been cleaned up more or less in Ukraine. It's electronic procurement. Won many, many awards. Some other countries can look up and learn from that. Not ideal, but much better than in many other places. Central bank, where we get, essentially the central bank finances specific banks, and they, finance specific, they issue loans to preferred clients. That has been cleaned up in 2014, 2016. And the third one is regulatory distortions, where you change the tariffs or you change the pricing somewhere, or you impose licensing entry barriers, so the barriers, regulator. So for that, and you essentially create monopolies that can capture, like energy monopolies, sometimes natural monopolies, sometimes not. That's in Ukraine. So now we have a specific conversation. We're asking where are the oligarchs today? They're in energy, they're in natural monopolies, they're somewhere there. That's where corruption potentially is, because they want to protect their rents. How do we address that? We create a strong competition authority, anti-monopoly committee. In the same way, we have done it in 2014, 2016 with the central bank. A strong, powerful, competent, independent regulator has been able to work miracles in Ukraine. On the first day of the war, the banks were running. There were no bank runs on the first day of the war, bombings. Jets are flying, people standing in ATMs, drawing cash. There was enough cash. There were no bank runs. And you can give me a country where on the day of the war, there's no bank runs. So here's a success story. Ukraine can do it with a clear focus on what needs to be done, structural reform. So we have to do competition authority. We have to do political campaign and lobbying reforms. And after that, there will be pressure to create proper judicial reform. It will be coming from businesses. So that has to be a design. And that things could be addressed in some conditionality or not. But we have to stop talking about, there's corruption, and start talking specifics. And then if we are concerned about corruption during the beginning of recovery period, then there is a simple answer. The government can offer what it wants to build, because in the beginning, there'll be a rapid rebuilding, right? It's not going to be investment in some venture capital kind of, it's going to be built housing. we know what the price of a square meter of a house is today. It's very difficult, and we know how to verify the quality of the house. So then we should talk about audit. The government of Ukraine wants to build it. Okay, there is funding, verify that it has been built. That's actually simple. If someone can, the government can make a bid and say, we are willing, or Ukrainian companies were willing to build it at this price. If someone can build at a lower price, well, please, right? So you can run an auction in procurement who can build cheaper. But I've been in, I've seen this rebuilding already. The overheads the US or sometimes some British companies are taking are higher than the corruption rents that people are taking in Ukraine. They are legal, but they are higher. So let's legalize the rents in Ukraine and be done with it. I mean, I'm being, of course, don't take it. I'm not serious in terms of we have, but what I mean is that sometimes if you start thinking in terms of square meters that you can build per dollar, you have a very different conversation. You start talking about how this gray market or semi-corrupt companies, how you can make them clean, how you can make them auditable, how you can make them financeable, how you can move them out of the gray zone into properly fully compliant zone. And then you'll say, okay, you can build twice cheaper, but you are not auditable because you're running here with some bribes. And then these guys will say, but we need to give bribes, otherwise we won't get permit. And then you have an answer the way you need to clean up and do a reform. So all of this, I don't subscribe to this, that behind every corruption, there is a name. I subscribe to the issue between every corruption case, there's a political economy problem. And we need to engineer it and reverse engineer it and remove it. That has been done in Ukraine. 8 years ago, our police were, I used this example earlier, our police was shooting at our protesters, our citizens in 2014. 8 years later, today, we are resisting and successfully to the second largest army in the world. That's growth. That's state building in 8 years. Fully corrupt police shooting its own citizens on pro-Russian premises because the president has decided to abandon the pro-European move. Into the country resisting a full-blown invasion by Russia. So Ukraine can change and is changing and has changed. So when we talk about corruption, that's a wrong narrative. It's an important narrative, but I think we can move towards understanding what the political economy issue, where the competition is lacking, how to remove barriers, and what is the design of the reforms. And I think that will be done. So in that sense, I'm more concerned about the sense of urgency disappearing once the war is over. Because right now, everyone wants to help Ukraine. But once the war will be over, people will not be dying anymore. The fact that 30% of population doesn't have housing, it will be like another country. Okay? That is my bigger concern. Rather than the governance, my concern is, will there be will? Because the danger from pragmatic perspective is that if Ukraine is not economically successful, there'll be an opportunity for populist government to come to power, which will weaken Ukraine and will create again a temptation for Russia to try to come in and establish dominance, maybe in a political way. So Ukraine has to be rebuilt so it has strong economy and people there are happy. And the narrative that you see Europeans betrayed you anyway after the war doesn't have a chance. Of course, it's not going to be like that, but Russia will try to use that narrative. They will try. So that narrative shouldn't have a chance. And then Ukraine has to have a strong economy so it can defend itself. Because stronger Ukraine means more secure Ukraine and more secure Europe. So basically, these are my remarks on recovery.
Yes,
Okay?
let me ask a follow-up question. When you're talking about reforms and Ukraine growing into their own institutions, how important is the prospect of EU membership? And we connect to the second part of the title here. And also with the thinking about the disappointment that there is right now about EU, how do you see this in the future? What will happen should things not play out as expected in terms of EU membership?
So Ukraine will be a member of EU when I cannot say, but there's no ideology left or right or conservative or liberal or something like that in Ukraine. If you look at the history of politics in Ukraine, there are two ideologies, pro-Russian and pro-EU. It's not pro-US, by the way, even though I would be pro-US, but I've been trained in the US, so I have a bias. It's pro-EU. It's a choice. It's really, you can put people on pro-EU or pro-Russia. And the pro-Russia faction is gone. So we will have all the, more traditional, more standard, I would say, ideological distribution. But for now, it was pro-EU and or pro-Russia. That's the ideology. This is the strongest force there is in terms of fundamental pulling force for Ukraine to change. It's a force of gravity. The EU is the center of gravity for Ukraine. Ukraine wants to become European. We want to be recognized as Europeans. We want to say that we deserve to be European, that we are fighting for European values. There are all these arguments and senses. People were killed in 2014 because the protests were to have a EU association agreement. So people paid in lives. And now about Russia, it's also about EU versus Russia. So that's a fundamental force which will change Ukraine for the better, and also has been changing Ukraine for the better over the last 30 years. And it can also be used strategically to leverage the changes needed both, in in the EU relationship with Ukraine, Ukraine relationship with the EU, and in Ukraine itself. That's very powerful. That's really the gravity. So there is this war and then the EU. These are two fundamental forces. If you want to understand Ukraine, that's basically how we should think about it. If we have some kind of a failure, we don't win, then the EU, we become Russian occupied, whether fully or partly, people will die, will suffer, So we are fighting against Russia because we are part of Europe. That's how it feels in Ukraine. Might not feel that way here, but that's how it feels in Ukraine. That's the politics, that's the domestic politics. And so our politicians will respond to these forces. Desire for freedom and desire to be Europeans. They will not be able to change it if the EU supports us. Something drastic has to happen. We would have to feel betrayed for things to start working different. Although we do feel betrayed about the Budapest Memorandum. A little bit, to put it nicely. Yeah.
Thank you again. Our time is almost over, but I want to ask our audience if there is any burning question.
Thank you. Very briefly, my name is Hans Corell, and I was the Under-Secretary General for Legal Affairs and the Legal Council of the United Nations between 1994 and 2004, 3 years at Boutros-Ghali and 7 years with Kofi Annan. I was involved in the establishment of all the present existing war crimes tribunals. And we see now a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council committing the most horrendous crimes, including the crime of aggression. The International Criminal Court does not have jurisdiction over their crime, and therefore I have, together with the first prosecutor of the Sierra Leone Tribunal and Aaron Kotler, former Minister of Justice of Canada, proposed a draft statute for a tribunal on the crime of aggression against Ukraine. And I know that President Zelensky has handed it over to a number of ambassadors, and they are now sounding the shall we say, atmosphere in the United Nations General Assembly for that. Let me also add very briefly that there is available on the web a guide for politicians on the rule of law. If you take down the words rule of law, a guide for politicians, you will find it. It's only some 40 pages and it doesn't cost anything. It is available both in Ukrainian and in Russian. And I wonder, Mr. Former Minister, if I could have a word with you after this session. Thank you.
Are there any questions for our guests before we close? Yes.
Thank you very much. Excellent discussion. My name is Elena Zubkovich, Director of Nordic Ukraine Forum. I totally agree that sanctions work, and so if they were not efficient, Russia would not have used the disinformation, those strong disinformation, to spread the word about this. And secondly, also about efficiency. I've been to Ukraine just recently, to Kyiv and to Kyiv Oblast, and I've seen incredible creativity and efficiency there. For example, there was a shell into the almost to the city center, and the next day the road where the missile has fallen down was already reconstructed. It's incredible. Moreover, I've been to Bucha and to Hostomel, and I've seen that many buildings been reconstructed as well. So Ukraine works very fast, and we see that it can do incredible things in a very brief timing. And finally, I would like to mention that we should think about the topic is about the future as well, and the future of Ukraine relates to the future of Russia. We do not talk much about this, but however, this integration of Russia is one of most evident how to say possible plans for it. We don't talk about this. We don't think about Chechnya, Tatarstan, and so on. But there are not many issues why Russia should stay as it is. So thank you very much for the excellent discussion.
Thank you for contribution from the audience as well. Do you have any last words? Our panelists? Then Nataliia.
Yeah, just thank you for both comments. And I want maybe to reiterate to Alina, right, about the future of Russia. I think we have a small coalition here with Tymofiy, and we really believe that Russians should finally start taking care of them on their own and not waiting for someone to come up with something. So that kind of scenario is a nice thing to do, but in any way, like, we think that's the way to go. And thank you very much also about your comments. We didn't talk about it today too much, about the accountability and compensation of damages, but that's a big deal. And maybe this kind of work would have also not less than sanctions kind of effect on Russian behavior, because eventually what they do, they violate all international laws, and they shouldn't be allowed to do it, and they should pay and be accountable for that. So thank you for that comment. We would really want to continue this.
Torbjörn wanted to also say some closing words.
Yes, I would be an extremely bad host to our friends from Kyiv if I forgot to mention that all of their work basically is about fundraising for good causes in Ukraine, but not for themselves. So here in Stockholm, we started Friends of KSE. That's actually fundraising for KSE so they can continue this important work. So I would just suggest that you go and check out. There's a website called friendsofkse.org, and it's very easy to make your own contributions to the school and make sure that they continue their good work. So with this, I'm done. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all. Our panelists and you audience for participating. Let's keep supporting Friends of KSE and KSE and Ukraine.